Welcome to the newest university in the world. My name is Ben Crocker, and I'm the Director of Special Programs here at the University of Austin. And whether you're joining us here in the room or you are watching at home on X on the live stream, or you're watching later, catching up on YouTube, we'd like to thank you for being part of this very, very special event tonight here. What is the University of Austin? Put simply, we are an institution of higher education dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth. Tonight, we're going to be living out that founding ideal. We exist for the fearless pursuit of truth, and further, we believe that the best way to pursue truth is through civil discourse. Since our founding, we've engaged in great conversations. Conversations in the name of civil discourse, conversations that challenge, that confound, that sometimes excite and sometimes electrify us. And so it was perhaps inevitable that we at the University of Austin would come to found the Austin Union, a forum for great conversations that might serve our culture as a great university. We think also that it might serve the culture of our great city, Austin, and that in turn, it might play its part in the renaissance of civil discourse in the United States and in the world at large. I want to acknowledge the fine contribution my colleague Olivia Hagee has made in pushing and founding this institution within the walls of this university. Thank you, Olivia. So tonight, the Union is going to come to life in the hands of our faculty and staff and guests. But come the fall, responsibility for running this institution will fall to our students, our brave first 100 students who are going to make up our founding class. And before we go any further, it behooves me to say that applications are open now. So if you are brave, if you are bold, if you consider yourself a founder and you are willing to come and join us in building something new and wonderful for this city and for this country, then apply to be a member of the founding class at the University of Austin. We have some of our wonderful admitted students in the audience here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. You are at the center of everything that we're doing here. So when you come here, you'll be learning directly from our professors. We're an institution that does not believe in locking our talent away. Our professors are leaving the ivory tower, and they are coming here to teach you. We believe in the art of great teaching. And one of the great teachers that you'll be learning from when you come here is the Dean of our Center for Politics, Economics, and History. Dean Morgan Marietta is not just going to be the dean of that center, he's also going to be the faculty sponsor for this Austin Union, which we are inaugurating here tonight. Now, he is going to be one of the debaters who will take the stage very shortly, but before he comes up here to contest, I'd like to welcome him to make some remarks on the nature of the union and what we're trying to achieve here with the Austin Union. Morgan.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining for this launch of the Austin Union. I wish I had thought of the Austin Union. I would enjoy taking all the credit and none of the blame, but honesty compels me to admit that I had not thought of it. The person who thought of it is sitting right there. I would like you all to join me in recognizing the godmother of the Austin Union, Olivia Hagee. When she first proposed this idea, we immediately knew that we had to do it because the idea is simple, it is compelling, and it is that true universities must have public debate, but not the kind of debate where one learns verbal combat and the not so gentle art of making your opponent cry in public, because they are not your enemy. They are your partner in seeking the truth. The purpose of debate is to test your ideas in public so that we can know if they are good or bad. And then you go out afterward and have a drink together, which is my plan for tonight. At the University of Austin, no one will be shouted down, but they might be shown to be wrong. Not me, of course. Other people might be shown to be wrong. But that is the right standard. No one will be shouted down, but they might be shown to be wrong. Because at a university committed to the fearless pursuit of truth, you must have public debate. Because public debate can be frightening. It requires courage, and courage requires practice. And debate is how you seek the truth. And that is what we're going to be doing here tonight. I thank you all for joining us at the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you, Morgan. Now, Morgan studies the political consequences of belief. He focuses on constitutional politics, political psychology, and facts in politics. He's the author of 4 books, including A Citizen's Guide to the Constitution and the Supreme Court, and most recently, One Nation, Two Realities, Dueling Facts in American Democracy, which sounds like a fascinating book we should all read. Morgan is the founding editor of the annual Supreme Court of the United States series at Palgrave Macmillan, and this focuses on the major rulings of the Supreme Court. It's now in its 6th year. He's a regular commentator on the court. His latest op-ed was published in Newsweek just yesterday. I'd encourage you to have a look at that. And his current book project is The Supreme Court of Facts, the role of the court in settling disputed perceptions of reality. Now, opposing Dean Marietta will be a very special guest here tonight. And I say a very special guest because in establishing the University of Austin, we have been warmly embraced and warmly supported by the rest of the educational community here in Texas. And Richard Albert is a representative from the University of Texas, and we're absolutely delighted that he has taken up the invitation to come and speak with us tonight. He is the William Stamps Farish Professor in Law, Professor of Government, and Director of Constitutional Studies at UT Austin. He's published over 30 books on constitutional democracy, including Constitutional Amendments, Making, Breaking, and Changing Constitutions, Amending America's Unwritten Constitution, and the Limits and Legitimacy of Referendums. Professor Albert has advised governments, parliaments, and political parties around the world, including currently as an appointed member of the 15-member Constitutional Reform Committee of Jamaica. His ideas on constitutional democracy have been cited by courts around the world, including in Brazil, Canada, Israel, Kenya, Kosovo, and of course here in the United States. Richard Albert holds degrees in law and political science from Yale University, the University of Oxford, and Harvard University. Ladies and gentlemen, to inaugurate the Austin Union tonight, would you please welcome Professors Marietta and Albert. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here. I suppose for the benefit of everyone watching and everyone here in the room, we should go over some ground rules. Each of the gentlemen are going to have 5 minutes to make an opening statement on the proposition. And tonight we're going to pose it in question form, and it's very simply, is the US Constitution broken? Following the opening statements, tonight we're going to actually have a free-flowing debate between the gentlemen on stage for about 25 minutes. And then we'll have at the very end 2 minutes set aside for closing arguments from either gentleman. After that, we'll open the floor for questions. And when we do open for questions, could you please raise your hand and be very careful to make sure you state who you are, where you're from, and then make a concise question formulated so that we can respond to it here on stage. So, is the US Constitution broken? Professor Albert will commence arguing in the affirmative, and Professor Marietta will then respond. Professor Albert, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I met your president for the first time just a moment ago, and I told him the truth, which is that I'm proud to be associated with this university tonight. Thank you for having me. Something extraordinary happened 235 years ago this month. The date was March 4th, 1789. That was the first day in the life of the US Constitution. It wasn't clear at the time whether America's grand experiment would succeed. After all, America's first Constitution had just failed, and dramatically so, creating serious doubt about whether it was possible to create a government ruled by the people. The question on everyone's mind here in the United States and abroad was, would America's second Constitution fail, just as had the first? The inaugural Congress of the United States was determined to make the Constitution work. And it did just that. The first Congress created the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, as you know, is a package of 10 amendments to the Constitution, a constellation of the most important rights there can be: assembly, belief, expression, dissent, and the press. Rights that set the foundation for America's resilient constitutional democracy. The Bill of Rights was possible, however, only because the Constitution allowed itself to be amended. Article 5 creates a procedure to authorize what James Madison described as useful alterations to the Constitution. Shortly after the Bill of Rights was enacted, the Supreme Court issued a ruling that the country believed to be wrong. And again, Article 5 proved its value as Congress and the states worked together to overturn the Supreme Court by enacting the 11th Amendment. The country soon thereafter confronted a constitutional crisis in the election of 1800. The country survived, but not before coming together, again using Article 5 to amend the Constitution to create the 12th Amendment. And so, in a span of 15 years, from 1789 to 1804, the Constitution of the United States was amended 12 times. 12 times. What can we infer, do you think, from the founding generation's frequent use of amendment? That Article 5 must be used. That is intended to give future generations the power to pursue the promise of the majestic words that open the doors to the Constitution in the preamble. A more perfect union. A more perfect union. Amending the Constitution is really doing justice and honor to the founders, because every amendment is an act in the continuation of the Constitution-making project initiated by the founders so long ago. And so a constitutional amendment is an exercise in constitutional fidelity. Here's the problem. For decades now, the power of amendment has sat unused, no longer used, no longer usable, and for many, no longer worth the parchment on which it was written. And that's a problem, because the founders' innovative design of Article 5 has been cast aside. No one thinking anymore about changing the Constitution through Article 5. And that's a problem. It's a problem of constitutional proportions. All of this, to me, raises a paradox, and here's the paradox. The Constitution of the United States, its text, remains frozen, unchanged for decades now. But the meaning of that text changes all of the time. All of the time. How can this be so? The answer is that the Supreme Court has commandeered the Constitution, routinely changing the meaning of the Constitution in defiance of Article 5. And so what are we to do about that? What are we to do? From my perspective, the conclusion that I reach in light of this reality of a frozen text, but an ever-evolving meaning, is that it's no longer accurate to call the United States a republic, nor is it accurate to call it a democracy. The most accurate description for the United States today is a juristocracy. Here, the judges rule, not the people. That's not what the founders had intended. That's not the founding design. They rejected juristocracy. We know this because they used Article 5 to overrule the Supreme Court.
Professor Albert, that is 5 minutes concluded.
I'm going to take just 10 more seconds for the final thought.
10 more
Because
seconds
I gave,
granted.
because
We'll be granted to you
I
as
gave your president 15 seconds.
That is true.
I'm going to take 10, not 15. I'm going to take 10.
You have 8 now.
The resolution before us asks, is the U.S. Constitution broken? The answer is yes, and it is because the Supreme Court has broken it.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Marietta, in reply?
Richard, thank you. I was very, very happy that you accepted our invitation to do this opening debate of the Union, because I agree with you on so many, many important things, but not this one. So my first observation this evening is that it is not the Constitution that is broken. It is us. The Constitution is not broken, but we are. We are divided. We are polarized. We don't like each other anymore. We can't compromise. But that's just in recent politics. In a longer frame, humans are deeply flawed creatures. I needn't give you the whole catalog, but we are selfish. We are self-seeking. We are arrogant. We are prideful. And I think I have some insight into that because I belong to, I think, the most prideful profession in the United States. And what is a constitution to do with such flawed people? Well, the good news is the Constitution was designed for such flawed people. The founders themselves had a very negative view of human nature. Madison himself famously wrote that if men were angels, we wouldn't need to have these debates about government. And if angels were ruling over us, then everything would be fine. But sadly, they are not. We only have flawed humans attempting to govern other flawed humans. And the Constitution's answer for that is to recognize those flaws and limit us. It is meant to restrain our flaws, because as flawed people, we will try to create a perfect society and solve all of these problems and do it very poorly. The amendment rule in the Constitution is that it can only be amended if we have a consensus, if we are in agreement. But we are not now, so we cannot amend it. We must keep the good rules because we will only gain bad ones if we try to amend it while we are divided. Imagine if we now started going back and forth and back and forth, and the battleground of our politics would become the Constitution itself. But the Constitution is meant to be what unifies us, not our divisive point. And what we agree on is that we want a free society. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect a free society. Before we can even argue about whether it's broken, we have to recognize its purpose. And its purpose is to establish and protect our liberties. The Constitution is a shield of your freedoms. It is not a race car. If we wanted it to be a race car to zoom off to a new and perfect future, we could try that, but I don't recommend it. A shield will not drive you off a cliff. A shield will not drive you into a wall. And our shield is not broken. The second point and the argument I'd like to make today is about the nature of hubris, which I have mentioned. I'd like to have a brief thought experiment. If you imagined walking out on the stage tonight, not us, but the founders themselves. If you had Washington, if you had John Adams, bring in Sam as well for the beer. Franklin, one of the great minds of his time. Jefferson, one of the greatest minds of all time. You had Hamilton, who I hear is not only a great statesman, but can also sing. Gouverneur Morris, who wrote the preamble, my favorite of the founders with the peg leg. And I left out almost James Madison himself. And if you have them all standing here, and recognize that the Constitution is not the product of one of those brilliant minds. It is the overlapping point or the consensus of those minds. And that is what true genius is the overlap of several geniuses. And ask yourself this one honest question. Who's smarter? Them or you? I have been accused of arrogance. There is evidence for that debate, which we can have at a different time. But I am not that arrogant. I honestly believe that if my views and conclusions dispute those brilliant people, they're probably right. And I should probably listen to them. At least judge very carefully before I decide that contemporary Americans are more talented than the founding generation. Let me conclude by saying that this is often called the dead hand problem, which Jefferson called it, that he didn't want the dead hand of the past to restrain us. And frankly, I think a lot of people in the contemporary world think that the dead hand is giving us the finger. But I don't think so. I don't. I think the dead hand of the past is holding us up. I think the dead hands are lifting us so that we can see above our own arrogance. The Constitution is not broken. It is the salvation of our brokenness.
Thank you. That is 5 minutes elapsed. By way of getting us into the debate, Professor Marietta, I wonder if we could start by addressing what's, and correct me if I'm not interpreting this the right way, what seems to be your fixed standard for excellence in the establishment of law, being the founders themselves. What do you say to Professor Albert, who seems to take us down the path of saying, well, yes, if the founders are this fixed standard, isn't amendment itself fidelity to them? Because that seems to be the argument that he may have a logical advantage on you on, because if we can just keep fixing things in order to be faithful to the founders' intentions, then does that debunk what you're saying?
Well, I think that they certainly believed it should be amended. Right? I think there was near universal agreement among them that some sort of amendment needed to happen. But they had a difference of opinion of how easy it should be or how difficult it should be. Jefferson thought it should be much easier to amend. Madison thought it should be much more difficult to amend. But the standard they came to, the overlap of the brilliant minds, was that it required a new organic act, a new consensus, similar to the Constitution itself. And they came up with these numbers of 2/3 of each House of Congress and 3/4 of the states. And that is a very high standard, but I still think it should be that high, because it must be an organic act of the people on which we all agree. And it should be amendable, but not easily amendable. The mistakes should be difficult. And we can talk about this, but I think those mistakes have been made at different points. But Rich, you think it should be more easily amendable. Should the standard go down from the 2/3 and 3/4 of the states? Or do you have an idea of what would be a more optimal level?
I have some ideas about how to remake Article 5, but we don't even need to get to that point, because I want to raise a contrast. The contrast is between Madison and Jefferson. You alluded to this very important contrast. And I'm glad you described Jefferson as one of the most brilliant, because indeed he was.
Yeah.
I consider myself to be a Jeffersonian in the sense of how we understand a constitution. Jefferson proposed that every generation should make its own constitution, so that the people could see in their constitution their present views and values reflected. Now, Jefferson was maybe brighter than even he believed, because he suggested that every 19 years, the people should write a new constitution. Here's the brilliance of it. If you take up all of the world's constitution, you average them out. What's the average lifespan of a constitution in the history of the world? It's 19 years. Now, the point about Jefferson that I want to associate myself with is that the people, you, should write your own constitution. It's okay to adopt the one that you have now, just to reenact it without any changes. That's fine. But the point is that by doing that, you're putting your own stamp of approval on it without feeling shackled to the past.
Yeah, what I would say to that is, earlier I mentioned that the Constitution is the overlap point of the great minds. And so you have Jefferson on the one side of the continuum that he thought, and he was truly a brilliant man, that it should be more amendable. And you had Madison and others on the other side of that continuum. But what they did is decide to take the central point of the different founders. It wasn't the extreme of Jefferson they decided was brilliant. It was more of a median position. And I would compare in this sense Jefferson to Washington. Jefferson was brilliant. And he built Monticello. And he bankrupted it. Because he really loved expensive books and wine, both of which are excellent. But he did not build a lasting institution. When it came to building lasting institutions, he was a bit too brilliantly erratic.
You're missing one. The great University of Virginia. That is Jefferson's.
I'll give you that one. He was definitely right about that. He was definitely right about that.
A standard for all public universities to aspire to, I would say. But, you know, what's interesting about Jefferson, one last point about Jefferson, if I could, is that if you look at the United States constitutions, including the state constitutions, he's one. There are about 15, 16 states that have adopted the Jeffersonian model, where every 10 or 20 years, everybody in the state has to answer the question, do you want a new constitution? They might say no, and that's fine. Keep the constitution. But the point is that whether they say yes or no, that makes it their constitution, not the constitution that was bequeathed to them, maybe imposed on them.
Yeah.
I'd be very happy.
That I like.
I'd be very happy if I'd be very happy if today Americans were given the chance to say yes or no on the Constitution. If they say yes, we're keeping it as is, great.
Well, I like the idea at the state level. That I very much like. Because states can be unique and they're quite unusual. And in our polarized world, the states are rather divided. If a state wanted to rewrite its constitution, that I would support, because states are meant to be different in a federalist system and the laboratories of democracy. It's the national constitution on which, if we really tried to put it up to vote now or amended it easily now, would lead to the great kinds of conflicts. And
it does serve a different function.
It does. I think that there's something to that. Because Eli Shapiro just wrote this book on foot voting, encouraging people to actually go to states where they agree with the culture and politics of the state. And we've had a great deal of that. Because of that, I think we could have much more amendable state constitutions. That strikes me as an excellent idea. Maybe that's one of the overlap points that we have. Yeah. But the national constitution, no. Only if we are in a national consensus, or the car will drive into the wall.
I just want to be clear. I'm not calling for a rewriting of the U.S. Constitution. I'm concerned that the power of change has been hijacked by a court. Right. And I'm not animated by the present Supreme Court. I've been writing about this for 20 years. In a paper in 2004 called The Constitutional Balance, I argued that the court had really run rogue because they have displaced the people as the authors of their own constitution. This is the problem, is that the Supreme Court has a role, which is to interpret the Constitution, not to rewrite it, but that's what it has been doing. Yeah. Roe was a rewriting of the Constitution, as was Dobbs. Both were rewritings of the Constitution. Both were inappropriate, hijacking the power of the people to write and rewrite their Constitution through Article 5.
So Richard, where would you pinpoint the flaw if we look at the entire governing structure, the separation of powers? Is this something structural? Is it something in the behavior of particular justices? Can you give us some context as to why you can say it's the behavior of the court and it's been at this particular juncture, or was this something that was one of the inevitable flaws of what we have at the founding?
I think there are two items to identify here. One is the extraordinary difficulty of constitutional amendment. Some see that as a flaw, some see that as a feature. But the more important point, I think, is related to something you said, Morgan, if I may, which is that Congress, nor the president, nor the states have asserted themselves over the Supreme Court. They've allowed the Supreme Court to become the dominant institution in the architecture of the US Constitution. And that's not the way it was intended to be. By the way, the Supreme Court was referred to as the least dangerous branch in the Federalist Papers. No one would have imagined, no one, that the Supreme Court would become as powerful as it had, choosing the winner of an election, determining which rights you have and don't have. I mean, this is not a role for the court. The role for the court is to interpret the Constitution, to interpret the statutes enacted by legislators, to rein in the president when he or she or they violate the Constitution, not to make new amendments to the Constitution. Yet that's what the Supreme Court has been doing.
So, Professor,
we agree.
Would you like to respond?
Yes, we very much agree on this, that the 20th century history of the Supreme Court was the court taking way more power than it is given under the system. And Rich and I agree that the written constitution, constitutionalism, the value of following a written basic law is remarkably important to civilization. And when the court decides that it can amend the Constitution without it being amended, the court becomes the agency of amendment, which is essentially what living constitutionalism is. This is why I essentially think that living constitutionalism is a misguided idea. It was born in the idea that elites could be smarter than the Constitution, what I've already argued against, and that the justices could rewrite it themselves by interpreting the change in values of the country without the country speaking, the justices themselves saying that we will speak for the country, which was never the design. So I think this is a deep problem of, again, not listening to the founders and following the written words of the founders.
It's a point of agreement between us, but I do want to highlight, if I could, just a point of disagreement. And the point of disagreement is that I think we lose something when we don't exercise our muscle of constitutional amendment. Those muscles atrophy. And the atrophy of the muscles of constitutional amendment, they erode the connection that the people have to their constitution. It's not the court's constitution. That's right. It's not Congress's constitution. It's not the president's constitution. It's the people's constitution. And not having amended the Constitution since 1992, some don't even count 92 as the last amendment because it's so irregular. Some go back to 1971. If that's the case, that's half a century without exercising the muscle that the founders wanted you to exercise. They did it 12 times in 15 years. That is nothing if not modeling for you how the Constitution should operate.
Let's maybe not completely leave that behind, but I think we're finding agreement on, perhaps we say the people are broken, the Constitution may be broken, but we agree that the court is broken. Marietta, do you think, what would be your threshold case? Or when do we say, okay, we've had a rough decade, a rough 50 years, a rough century? Is there a point at which you would take this idea seriously that this is just not cutting the mustard and we need to, a dead hand has to have a virtuous outcome on why we're persisting with it?
Yes. When the dead hand has actually lifted us up to look over on our own arrogance, when we have done that, then I will agree. When it is clear that the movements to amend the Constitution understand the Constitution as it is written. They are not petulant. They are not asking for the race car to zoom off and solve problems. The founders' vision was clear that flawed humanity should be freed. And that's a strange contradiction, but if humans are flawed, they must be freed to fix themselves through the exercise of their own rights and the recognition of their own equality. If we did that, if it were much more thoughtful, then I would support it. But I frankly don't see that. That's why institutions like University of Austin is so important, where the idea is to focus on the history and significance of the ideas we have inherited, and then begin to apply them and think about improvements of the world. But there's such a hurry, there's such a McDonaldization of jumping to it so quickly before we have done that first part. That I would deeply support.
There's a lost tradition of amendment in this country, and I think I agree with you, actually, Morgan, that we don't want to give the people at present all of the power because they're not going to agree on anything.
Yeah.
And you might not even trust them. Now, I trust the people because my understanding of a constitution is that the highest source of legitimacy is the people themselves. That's, for me, a constitution. You may think of a constitution as a document, a piece of paper, a thing, a noun. I think of a constitution as an action, as a verb, as a doing, as a becoming and a re-becoming by which the people define themselves and redefine themselves consistent with the rules in the Constitution. But that's not what we've had. You know, just yesterday, Morgan, Ireland went to the polls to vote on a constitutional amendment. They have a practice of amending the Constitution. They're used to doing it. But they don't just hold amendments and that's it. I mean, hold amendment referendums and that's it. They mount these campaigns to educate the voters about the options, the consequences of a vote, and what the outcome will be if they vote yes or no. Now, one might worry that this process could be manipulated one way or another, but they have an independent entity that manages these kinds of elections and referendums so that the people go to the polls without having to worry about the driver driving the car off the cliff. People go informed. Can you imagine having an entity like that here in the United States that was interested only, not in outcomes, no, but in the process, ensuring that people are well informed and know full well the consequences of their vote, yes, no, or not.
See, I might still worry. I'm afraid that we have a different sense of trust in the people about this. Even in the history of the amendment of the US Constitution, I wanted to ask you about this. If you set the Bill of Rights aside and just take the 17 recent amendments, were they all good? Were all 17 positive contributions to constitutionalism? Were some of the mistakes? I can name two that I think were dramatic mistakes. I think 2 out of the 17 were quite flawed, which is way over 10%. Do you think they were all good? Were mistakes made?
My answer to that question is, I don't care. I care more about the act of amendment. The content for me, the outcome for me doesn't matter. When the people rule, you take the sour with the sweet, whatever the outcome. And that means that you must allow the people to make mistakes. Those mistakes can be corrected by subsequent amendment. That, for me, is the point. Now, the founders were brilliant, but they believed very deeply in their creation, and they made it hard to amend. Let me tell you just how hard they made it to amend the Constitution. You've explained the threshold. 2/3 approval in both houses of Congress, 3/4 of the states needed to ratify. That threshold is higher than the threshold that was required to enact the Constitution in the first place. That's unusual. You don't usually have an amendment procedure that is harder to consummate than to write a new constitution. So that's the evidence that they believed very deeply, profoundly in the near perfection of what they created. But they wanted still to make it possible for you to amend the Constitution. They didn't make the Constitution unamendable. Some constitutions in the world are unamendable. Not this one. John Locke wrote the Constitution of the Carolinas. He made it unamendable. They learned from that experience, and they didn't make the Constitution unamendable. They made it hard to change, but they wanted it to be changed because they knew that you either change it and keep it, or you discard it and replace it. They did not want their Constitution to be replaced. They wanted it to endure for all times. And now here we are. 235 years later, the machine is still going, but the connection that the people have to this marvelous creation is being eroded. Because it's no longer the people's constitution, it's the court's constitution.
Let me ask you a pointed question. Do you think if the power of amendment was brought closer to the people, was made easier, was brought within firmer grasp, would we have a better country or a worse country? Or is the principle that it just doesn't matter, that there is a moral principle in bringing the people closer to their constitution regardless?
The principle is that the people are the masters of their constitutional home. The Article 5 procedures, that's the deed to the House. That's the deed to the Constitution. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And so, for me, the power of exercising the right to amendment is a way of reinforcing one's ownership of the Constitution. Because if that goes, and it has gone, then it's no longer your Constitution. And we see evidence of this in the states. The states, Morgan, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. I endorse your comment that there's a distinction, meaningful distinction, between a state constitution and the US Constitution. Very important distinction. But if you look at the social science about how people interact with their state constitutions, they actually feel a very close connection to it. It's within their reach. It's graspable. They're asked regularly, do you want to change it? They're asked to vote on it regularly. There are popular initiatives. They can suggest amendments themselves. So there's a disconnect between the people and their constitution. And I might say, Morgan, connecting it to your opening remarks, which were persuasive to me. The fact that there is a disconnect between the people and their constitution, that might be the reason for the disenchantment that you've identified.
So I think the most exciting part of that argument is that this kind of tantalizing idea that by giving the people a greater enfranchisement in their constitution, you might create the moral and just people that a good constitutional order deserves. Do you agree with that, or do we just have to put up with it until the good people come back by some other means?
I have my fears of giving the adolescents the keys to the car before the teaching is in place. Some of you might have been wondering which of the amendments, or the recent ones, I did think were wrong. The obvious one was the 18th. That was corrected by the 21st. And Richard, you made the point that these things are correctable, but often at great cost. We had a dozen or 13 years of tremendous violence, tremendous disruption in the country. I might add a tremendous loss in whiskey distilling knowledge of bourbon in the Americas, which I deeply regret. But the other one that I actually think was really quite bad was the 26th, which is youth voting. And I might lose a few of the students in the audience with this argument. But I don't think, just like the 18th was not put in place, honestly, many of you might know that the 18th was put in place as a war effort to save grain, to not use it in World War I, which ended by the time it went into place, when it really had other much nastier motives. It was an anti-immigrant sentiment that the Protestants didn't like the Catholics, the Irish, and the Italians drinking so much. It had negative motives. It was not passed honestly. And the youth amendment of voting wasn't entirely honest either. That was grounded in the argument that because we are sending boys to Vietnam, that they should be able to vote on it. You could argue the mistake was the first one rather than the second one. I still don't know why we changed the process of bringing soldiers into the army from World War II and the Korean War, when the draft was people in their 20s and 30s as well. We didn't think the draft was simply for 18-year-olds. The mistake was probably changing it to be 18-year-olds, but since we had made that mistake, we decided they had to vote as well. But a professor of mine used to say to students, and we didn't like it at the time, you don't know anything yet. And I don't think that the nation was improved by 18-year-olds voting. I think it requires more teaching first. It requires more knowledge of the founding first. I think they should take ownership of it, but I think that comes with time. In other words, I don't think we should rock the vote. The vote should not be rocked. It should be carefully considered. It should not be rocked. That could be one of my more controversial things today to say, but even if you don't agree with me on the 26th, you might on the 18th. But I'm afraid that mistakes will continue to be made, especially in the current polarized world.
And on the subject of mistakes, what if the Supreme Court makes a mistake? What happens when the Supreme Court gets it wrong? You're stuck with it, because the only way to fix that error is to overrule the Supreme Court by constitutional amendment. That's happened 5 times in American history. Can't do it today. Partisan division, division across the country. You can't agree. Congress can't even pass a law. Imagine getting 2/3 of both houses of Congress to agree to an amendment and 3/4 of the states to ratify that amendment, which means that you're stuck with the Supreme Court's rulings. If you're ideologically aligned with the current Supreme Court, congratulations. You won't always be. What happens then? Which is why it's better to cast your lot with the people who have the power through Article 5 to change the errors, fix the mistakes that the Supreme Court makes. I did want to say one more thing if I could, because I don't want to give the impression that I think the founders were perfect, because of course they were not. They made something unamendable in the US Constitution. One thing was made unamendable. If you don't know what unamendability means, let me give you some examples. The German Basic Law, which operates as its constitution, makes human dignity unamendable. This, of course, is a response to the horrors of the Second World War. The Brazilian Constitution makes federalism unamendable. France makes republicanism unamendable, a rejection of monarchy. Namibia makes all rights and freedoms unamendable. The one thing that the US Constitution makes unamendable, anyone know? Unamendability opens a window into the soul of the Constitution, reveals its deepest inner workings. The US Constitution made the international slave trade unamendable. Now, I reject that for 2 reasons. 1, for obvious reasons. 2, nothing should be unamendable. Freezing the text of a constitution denies the people the power to take ownership of their constitution. So, I don't want to be read as making the case that the founders were perfect. They made many mistakes. This is one of them. But they did create Article 5, which is a way for the people to exercise their authority, their sovereignty over the Constitution.
Thank you, Professor Albert. We now have the opportunity for each side to make a 2-minute closing pitch. We've heard some fantastic arguments either side and a lot of agreement. So maybe this pursuit of truth is off to a very good start, if your opinions are anything to guide the rest of us by. Would you like to begin, Professor Marietta, with your 2-minute closing?
Oh, I thought,
oh, you would like to? Okay.
Sure.
Whoever would like to go.
Happy to go. First, I want to reiterate just how valuable I think this forum is. I think the Austin Union, which was the innovation of my former student, Olivia, one of the best students I've had, you're really modeling for the country how to have constructive dialogue. At a time, as Morgan mentions, when the country may be as divided as ever since the Civil War, this is a great way to turn down the temperature and to have civil discourse in a way that can give us hope for the future of this country. On the subject of the question, is the US Constitution broken? It's broken, but I'm pointing my finger not at the Constitution, nor to the framers, but to the court. And I would have made the same argument 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The point is not to disagree with the content of what the court does today. Whether I agree or not with Dobbs is not the point. The point is that the Constitution has become theirs, And that's not what the founders had wanted. They rejected juristocracy. They showed us how to overturn the Supreme Court by using Article 5. We could still do that. But we have to fix the problem that Morgan, I think, so brilliantly identified, which is the division that really afflicts us today. I don't know, Morgan, what the path forward is, but I hope you have a solution, because we do need to regain the lost tradition of amendment in this country.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to go last because I wanted to end by thanking Richard for joining us for this launch of the Austin Union. It's a great pleasure to have you and an honor to have this kind of conversation. And exactly as I hoped, he is the kind of scholar with whom one can have this kind of discussion and debate and disagreement and agreement. And this is what we hope to continue. My whole career, I've made the argument that the Constitution is not an elite document that is meant to be read just by judges in robes and debated by law faculty. FDR described it as not a lawyer's document, but a layman's document. It is ours and meant to be debated by us. I'd like to end with the famous quote by the great Texan Barbara Jordan. And when she was speaking in Congress during the Nixon impeachment, she famously said, "My faith in the Constitution is whole. It is complete. It is total." Why? Is it because as a black woman she had faced no hurdles? No. Is it because as a lesbian she was accepted everywhere? No. It is because she knew that the principles laid down by the brilliant framers were the path to a free society. My faith in the Constitution is whole. It is complete. It is total. I know that Richard also has faith in the Constitution and the idea of constitutionalism. Where we disagree is how amendable it should be. Should it be teaching us, or should we be attempting to teach it? And that, I think, is the great question that we have to ask ourselves and answer. I believe the Constitution is not broken. It is the salvation of our own brokenness. And with that, thank you.
Professor, thank you very much. Before we move to Q&A, I'll just say we are not going to declare a winner tonight, lest we spark a civil war on the grounds of the Capitol between these two great institutions. But I want to thank you again for the wonderful contributions and arguments you've made. And we are going to have time now for 10 minutes of Q&A. We do have to make sure we stay on schedule.
This question, I think, is more for Professor Albert. You made the point really emphatically that we are living in a juristocracy, but you also mentioned several times that the partisanship that we have is slowing down the mechanics of our country and of Congress. And so I kind of have a two-part question. My first one is, do you really think it's the fault of the Supreme Court if it is the Congress that is not passing amendments? Don't you think that if there's no laws being passed, I think every year we set a new record for fewer and fewer bills, don't you think that means that if the Supreme Court does nothing, we have a static democracy and a static set of laws? And then my add-on question to that is, if the Congress is doing very little, we've had several decades of growth in executive power. Some would say executive overreach of the executive branch. Don't you think that the Supreme Court then must be more activist and must be more involved to do the job that the Congress is not, of legislating the executive branch? Thanks.
Thank you so much for both questions. Really fun questions to to ask and to answer. The design of the US Constitution is to make possible incremental change. That's why it's so hard to do anything. It's hard to amend the Constitution. It's hard to pass a bill into law. And that has an advantage. It means that it makes it hard to do bad things, but the consequence is that it makes it hard to do good things too. In the face of all of this, the role of the court is not to look to Congress and say, you're not doing anything, so we'll do it for you. The role of the court is to protect the Constitution. When Congress passes a bill into law, the role of the court is to evaluate whether that law is consistent with the Constitution. Not to say, well, they're not doing anything, so we're going to take a step further and amend the Constitution to do what they could not do. Because you see, when that happens, that transforms inappropriately the role of the court from interpreter to author. And the court is not the maker of the Constitution. It should not be that. It has become that, but it should not be that. Any thoughts on this, Morgan?
Yeah, I think that I very much agree, and this is a very good question. There's this argument in constitutional circles that the Constitution is self-adjusting, which is to say that if the powers of one branch are being blocked or can't be executed for any reason, powers of the other branch simply rise to meet the occasion. I think this is fundamentally wrong. This was not the constitutional design. If we're polarized and can't make a decision, then we don't make a decision. Then the decision is that we don't do anything, that we stay where we are. People don't gain additional powers over us because other people don't have them. The court has taken the role of filling some of this space, sometimes quite badly, but sometimes well. One point I want to make is that in an era of polarization, when some institutions are asserting powers that they constitutionally do not have, then the court becomes busy. And you could say the court is busier now than it was before, but that could well be because there's so much bad behavior that the court has to rein in. You'll note that this term, the court is reining in a great deal of the administrative state. And that is because the administrative state has taken on more and more and more power, and the court is beginning to recognize that it has exceeded the bounds of the Constitution. In an era of bad behavior, the court will be busy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No disagreement there, only to say that one must be, I think, outcome neutral. You can't reverse engineer how you feel about the court. If the court is acting in a way that you like, but still defying Article 5 in its role, it's inappropriate to say, well, good. You can't cheer that along because you're not going to always be on the same side. We have, I think, to take cover in procedure. Procedure protects everyone.
Yes. Right. Sir, in the front, you had a question. Let's go to you next.
If there was a constitution of the states, and you were each asked your suggestions regarding amending Article 5 and the thresholds within Article 5, what would your suggestions be?
Did you all hear the question? If there's a convention and we're given the option of making recommendations for how to change Article 5, the procedure of amendment, what would those be?
You mean whether we would keep the 2/3 of each house and 3/4 of the states and...
I asked it in understanding that you may not want to make any change.
Yeah. Some of you might think that I would want to raise it. No, I don't think so. I think the current standard is right. I think if we lowered it, it would lead to more errors, more 18th Amendment problems that we would have to fix after years of violence with the 21st. So I would keep it where it is.
Can't make it any harder than it is because that would make it unamendable.
But
I'm not suggesting...
One thought, just to be clear, it isn't that there's a continuum from easily amendable to where we are now. The continuum is easily amendable. Where we are now is actually in the middle, and then there's unamendable.
That's right.
We are in the golden mean right now.
Well, we're closer to unamendable than not. But to answer your question, I would not make Article 5 easier. I would add a new path to amendment. Because right now, every amendment proposal has to go through Congress. So there are two paths. Congress initiates, where 2/3 of each house proposes an amendment. It's then transmitted to the states, where 3/4 must ratify if the amendment is to become valid, or the other path, 2/3 of the states petition Congress to call a constitutional convention where the delegates propose amendments to the Constitution, and those amendments are then ratified by 3/4 of the states if they are to become valid. In both paths, the gatekeeper is a Congress. Congress has to propose in the first. In the second path, Congress has to recognize the validity of the petitions. What if there's an amendment that someone wants to make, all of you want to make, to impose term limits on Congress, or to reduce the pay of congresspersons, or to do something that rebalances the power between Congress and the presidency, or whatever the case may be? Congress is not going to be hospitable to that amendment. And so, to answer your question, thank you for the question, I would add another route to amendment that doesn't go through Congress, that bypasses the Congress. What might that be? I have many ideas. One idea is to allow the president to send an amendment proposal directly to the people in a national referendum. But it wouldn't be just 51% plus one. That would not be sufficient to amend the Constitution, because then you just have the coasts being able to agree. You'd have to have a certain kind of quorum where the threshold required to ratify the referendum would be high enough such that we would be confident that it reflected the considered judgment of the people of the United States, not just 50% plus one. So that's an alternative amendment procedure that circumvents the possible obstruction that we get with Congress, and that simultaneously validates and reinforces the reality that this is a popular sovereignty, where here the people rule. That's one idea.
Okay. If there are other questions, you will need to make them in 15 seconds, and I'll give the gentlemen 1 minute each to respond if anyone else has a further question. Yes, sir, at the back, I think your hand was up first. So let's have you state very quickly the question, and I'll give each speaker 1 minute.
Sure. My name is Cabot. I'm from Austin. And the question is, it seems like the Supreme Court issue overreach is kind of a structural issue. What kind of amendment or other resolution would either of you propose to sort of resolve that, or is that unresolvable?
Right. Well, I thought this might come up earlier about the limitation on the terms of the justices. Akhil Amar, who's a great constitutional commentator, and I think both of us have a high regard for
He was my
Amar.
professor.
Yeah. He has been advocating this solution. And I forget exactly how the math works out. I believe it's 18-year terms, and that gives every president, is it 1 or 2 appointments? And they would be staggered in this way. And that would avoid a number of the problems. It would avoid the problems of the very aged justices not retiring or leaving unexpectedly. It would change a lot of the dishonest theater of the appointment and the confirmation process, which, it's too bad we don't have time to talk about this, but we might agree that that has become rather dishonest and too much theater and not enough substance. And it would avoid a lot of these problems. So I would support that amendment, contrary perhaps to what I've said before. I would support that amendment, but at the threshold of public discussion and the 2/3 and 3/4. And I think that would go a long way to solving the problem that you mentioned.
1 minute, Professor.
That's one possibility. Another possibility is to look back to the founding era for an answer to the question of what to do with a court gone rogue. In Pennsylvania, there was a body called the Council of Censors. In New York, there was a body called the Council of Revision. What do these bodies do? There were bodies in Pennsylvania staffed by people, just like you, elected every 7 years to review the rulings of the High Court. Did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? If they got it right, those judgments were annulled. This is, I think, another idea that one could put on the table for how to rein in a court, and also how to ensure that the Constitution is interpreted in a way that's consistent with present views and values. So that's a second possibility to add to the one that Morgan brought to the table. But there are many. many ideas out there for how to rein in the court. And again, remember, I would make this argument today, just as I would as strongly 20 years ago, 30 years ago, has nothing to do with the current ascendant conservative supermajority on the court. Nothing to do with that. I may be conservative for all you know. The point is a structural one. It's a principled one, where we put our faith in procedure with the hope that the right outcomes will be produced as a result.
Richard, Albert, Morgan, Marietta, thank you very much for your time, for your contributions.